Hi, welcome to today's program. We'll get going in just a minute. Hello, good day. My name is Melinda Frost, and I'm leading the risk communication activities under the Infodemic management pillar of the World Health Organization's response to COVID-19. We're glad that you've joined us today. This is the second of two sessions in the media and journalism track of the WHO's third virtual global infodemic management conference. Today's session is titled The Solution, Infodemics in the Media, Preparing for the Future. This bridges from our first session, which occurred a week ago. That was titled The Challenge, Infodemics in the Media, Learning from the Past. Okay, so far you've heard me say the word infodemics maybe about 5 times. Before I go any further, let me go ahead and define what it means to the World Health Organization. We define an infodemic as an overabundance of information. Some of it is accurate and some of it is not. It occurs during an epidemic or a pandemic, so an acute public health crisis. And when it really makes it hard for people to find trustworthy sources and reliable guidance when they most need it to make reliable and relevant decisions in their own lives. So the vision of this conference is the overall conference, not just the media and journalism track, is to identify concrete problems and solutions that we, as a whole of society, will commit to addressing for the next infodemic, because like epidemics and pandemics, there will always be another infodemic. So the plenary session, which will occur on Friday, December 11th, will take the results of all 6 tracks from this conference, and they range anywhere from ministries of health to UN agencies to technology companies, and of course, the most important, journalism and media. So today's session is going to be an open discussion, a little bit less structured, to hear different perspectives on infodemics and how they've affected the media industry, and to hear the solutions that have come from these. Following this, there are going to be a series of breakout cafes, which some of you have been invited to. If you're a participant in this conference, some of you may have received an invitation from a WHO email address to attend a breakout session following today's conversation. With that, let me just go ahead and introduce a couple of points from last week's session so that you can better see where we're going to go to today. Before I go any further, I really have to thank our partners in this. The BBC Media Action and Internews have been great helps in this planning of this conference session. So today, I should say, we're reflecting from the things that we learned during last week's session, again, that covered the challenges associated with an infodemic. We had an open panel session, much like we'll have today. We had a series of breakout sessions. And some of the things that we learned from these breakout sessions, which we referred to as repair cafes, were that there were some key challenges in infodemics for the media. Some had to do with the volume of information, the time and speed and lack of time to verify and fact check, to things like sources of information, people who consider themselves experts but are not actually experts but felt empowered to have a voice in this, politicization and political issues, personal agendas that surrounded information coming out about COVID-19, and then people's relationship with social media and so on. There were, however, some positive outcomes, and that had to do with the fact that, while there's so many divisions and the difficulties of the pandemic, it really made us more aware of things like misinformation that we may have always had in our environment, but really it opened our eyes and made us really appreciate the role of fact-checking. It also helped us to better understand that our audience need complex information simplified and made more relevant and actionable in their lives. It also helped us to see the need for different approaches, having more empathy in our communications and being less combative. And the infodemic pushed many of us as media professionals to be accountable in what we produce and to give less airtime and less voice to mis and disinformation. Also understanding the issues, starting with the most recently published scientific articles and to really educate ourselves and make sure that we reach out to experts in this area so we better understand the complex science behind COVID-19. So these were just some of the outcomes, the things that we learned from last week's conversation that I thought I would share before we start this week's conversation. And with that, today we have a great set of panelists that are going to have a really open discussion with each other. I'm going to turn it over to our moderator today, Yvonne McPherson from BBC Media Action USA. Thank you.
Hello and welcome, and thank you for joining this discussion, and thank you to the World Health Organization for convening a conversation around the role that media plays in managing the current and future infodemics. If you're watching this live today on YouTube, December 9th, the Q&A function is open and you are welcome to type in your questions and we will try to answer them in the Q&A or in the panel itself. As Mindy mentioned, the focus of today's conversation is on how to reduce the negative impact and harm caused by the current infodemic and how we might prevent and manage future epidemics and pandemics and infodemics. Now, I'd like to invite each of the panelists to introduce yourselves and to let us know what you're working on right now as it pertains to COVID-19. Let me start by inviting Anna to introduce herself.
Right, thank you so much, Yvonne, and thank you to the WHO and the organizers. My name is Anna Miti. I work for the Zimbabwe Broadcasting Corporation as a radio producer. I mainly do health programs that include COVID-19 and other health issues as well. But I'm also involved in media training with the Humanitarian Information Facilitation Center. They work in partnership with an organization called AVAC, and we basically, try to capacitate journalists to cover better issues to do with science and research, and that also includes COVID-19. So that's part of the work that we've been doing. As recent as last week, we actually had a really successful meeting where we were just trying to capacitate journalists on COVID-19 reportage in Zimbabwe.
Thank you, Anna. Laurie? Do we have Laurie Garrett with us? Oh, Laurie, you're on mute.
My name is Laurie Garrett. I'm in America, New York. I do all kinds of stuff, foreign policy columnist, write columns all over the place, MSNBC, etc.
Thank you. Jamil, followed by Schweib.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for the invite, Yvonne. I am a journalist from Brazil. I'm a columnist for several media outlets in Brazil, but I'm based in Geneva. And for the last 20 years, I've been covering the UN and WHO, amongst other institutions, always related to the multilateral system, but also, obviously, diplomacy, foreign policy, basically from the point of view of developing countries.
Thank you. Schweib?
Hello, this is Schweib Sherifi. I'm the country director for BBC Media Action in Afghanistan. I have been in the media for the past 20 plus years, and mostly I have got a news and current affairs background. And we have been in the past 8-9 months doing a lot of activities on COVID-19 as BBC Media Action Afghanistan, including training journalists based on a handbook, COVID-19 handbook for journalists. So somehow how to deal with the infodemic and also misinformation, for specifically guideline training book for journalists. And we have also been producing a lot of PSAs, as well as having had town hall debates of bringing the local communities discussing COVID-19 with relevant religious leaders as well as health workers. Thank you.
And finally, Liz.
Hi, thank you very much for having me. I'm Liz Corbyn. I am the head of news for the European Broadcasting Union. It's the world's largest alliance of public service media organisations. We represent more than 100 of them in more than 50 countries. And we, in the news department, we're in touch with newsrooms in all of these organisations on a daily basis. So this year has been challenging, but really interesting to see it from the perspective of all of those different organisations. And just to be clear for anybody watching, I'll probably say public service journalism quite a lot, and what I mean by that is it is journalism that is done, controlled and financed by the public for the public, and a lot of the time that's your national broadcaster. Our members reach more than 1 billion people in terms of audiences. So that's kind of the scale that we're operating on.
Fantastic. Thanks, everyone. I want to start by addressing one of the most frequently asked questions I hear about managing infodemics. How can the media best deal with misinformation communicated by opinion leaders, political leaders, celebrities, influencers that is inconsistent with trusted health authorities? We are all well aware of this problem. It happens in many countries around the world. So let's focus on how you as journalists mitigate this challenge. Who would like to take that one first? How about you, Liz?
Thank you. Last and then first. Thank you. No, I appreciate it. It's obviously been a huge challenge this year, and there's so many different ways to think about it. So our members, of course, were engaged in a lot of fact checking, and a lot of them upscaled their fact checking teams to work on mis and disinformation, but also in answering people's questions. And I think what we saw this year was an enormous demand for information. Just the scale of the demand was beyond what anybody could actually deliver, and that led to this void which could be filled by information, disinformation on all of the different platforms. And in order to counter that, it was fact checking is one thing, but also just providing a huge amount more information than they previously were. So one of the things that we saw is where the rest of the economy and other industries were shutting down, and in fact within our own organizations, other productions were shutting down, the news departments were in fact increasing their output. And we saw a 20% increase in programming across our members this year. So just supplying more quality journalism into the public domain has been really important in terms of tackling that. But also that fact checking should not be a niche practice. It shouldn't just be reserved to certain parts of the website or certain programs. It needs to be part of the general conversation, and getting really getting to the heart of what the audiences want. So really listening to their questions and their concerns and what they need the answers to, what information they want. Really understanding our audiences and getting closer to them and adapting our output to respond to that has been what we've seen to be the most successful thing this year. In terms of, you talked about the mis and different information that you get from people in power. That was a really interesting journey. Now, of course, for the last kind of 4 or 5 years in particular, we've seen huge attacks on quality journalism in a way that we hadn't previously experienced. And I think if anything positive was to come out of 2020, a kind of reversal or a re-understanding of the value of quality journalism has been one of the good things that's come out of this year. The general public have the trust in public service media has always been high, but has been gradually falling over the last few years, and we've seen a spike in trust, and that's important for the future and for protecting what we do in future. But of course, at the beginning of the pandemic, all of the politicians and, you know, in government and in opposition knew that they needed the media. They've spent the last few, some of them have spent the last few years being incredibly rude and detrimental to the quality news media, but they needed us, and that really showed. So so we put a lot of politicians on air in the early parts of this crisis, and that was what our audience expected. But then with that kind of guaranteed airtime came the problem that the politicians realized they had all of this free airtime and started to use it for politicization of this crisis. And
Thank you. And it's on that very point, if you don't mind, I'd love to hear Jamil follow up on that point.
Yes, thank you, Yvonne. And Liz, you're absolutely correct. The fact that we have given more space to politicians because basically the state became a center stage of the response to a public crisis. So all those theories that everything had to be privatized somehow fell apart when people came and asked, where's the state? Where's the state? And suddenly, yes, we need to hear what authorities, leaders have to say. The trouble I have personally is obviously the president of Brazil, in the case Jair Bolsonaro, who takes this, what you said just now, politicization, to its limits or goes beyond those limits. And my daily, basically, task is basically to check everything he says and to verify if that actually has any substance or any basis that can actually be or should be given to the public as well. So I know that Laurie is going through that as well, or went through that. You're in springtime already. We are not at springtime. We're still in deep winter. But the truth is, misinformation became a political tool. And it's not new, obviously. We know that since forever, misinformation has been a political tool. The challenge today is obviously to make sure that we have the means to counter that and to, in a way, challenge that with a very, I would say, with as efficient as fast as it can be. So, for example, here at the WHO, we had several occasions where Bolsonaro manipulated what the direction of the WHO said on different aspects, cutted phrases, edited videos in order to fulfill his own line in Brazil. So that was a big challenge, something that we are.
So I'd like to know how you've managed that. And I'd also like to hear from Laurie, given her smiles. Laurie, do you want to come in on ways to mitigate this challenge?
Well, I've been in the middle of more than 35 epidemics and 2 pandemics before this. And every single epidemic, by definition, causes mass hysteria, causes a certain level of conspiracy thinking, fear, misinformation. There are always profiteers trying to sell bogus products. There are always lying pseudoscientists. All of this is normal, quote unquote, in an epidemic. But this time, like my friend in Brazil, I'm dealing with that the major conveyor of lies, outright lies, not just you're being so polite to say misinformation, outright lying is our own head of state. This means that I'm living in the epicenter, New York City, and it means that we have constantly been deluged, not just every day, not just every hour, but by minute with lies from the government. And the lies are not insubstantial. They go right to whether or not people will wear a mask, whether or not people will practice social distancing, whether or not people will stay at home when they're sick or just go right back to the office and infect everybody else, whether or not people pull out guns and try to kill those who want to enforce distancing regulations. I live in a country where some states it's legal for people to walk down the streets carrying guns and to wave them at people they disagree with. I also live in a country where the issues that were long-standing discords within our society have been conflated with the COVID crisis to a substantial degree, and the key one being racism, so that on one day it would be a Black Lives Matter demonstration against police brutality, and it would turn right into overlapping into COVID issues and whether or not, if you're a Democrat and you're Black, you wear masks. But if you're a Republican and you're white, masks are a source of oppression and you refuse to wear them.
So given all of your experience, what works? What works to try to mitigate all of this?
Well, the problem is I don't think we have an example of what works, because what has happened is that everybody has not only polarized around their views of the epidemic and politically, but they've polarized in terms of what media they turn to. So yes, I'm scrupulous. Of course, I fact check everything. Yes, I'm constantly filled with angst about trying to determine if something is true and express it correctly. And that goes to as well the hard science, because the majority of all science is now coming out without having been peer reviewed. So we as journalists have to act as peer review referees on scientific papers. But there is a point where it's clear here and in many other countries, I know this is also the case in the UK and in parts of France, and certainly I'm sure in Brazil, is that those who are on the right follow right-wing media. Those who are on the left follow left-wing media. So I can be as scrupulous as I want to, but it's never going to affect what almost half of our society believes to be truth, because they're not going to read what I write. They're not going to listen to me on the radio, and they're not going to watch me on national television, because they've rejected all the outlets I'm involved with as they are the lie. So we who are mainstream media are considered, as our president calls us, fake media. We are denounced by the president of the United States and by all of his supporters. And so our key problem, and I don't see a solution, if anybody knows one, I'm happy to hear about it, is that we can be as scrupulous as we want to be, but half the nation isn't paying any attention to what we say, isn't watching our media, and is listening to this very deep well of right-wing conspiratorial thinking that overlaps into a thing called QAnon that actually believes the Democratic Party runs pedophile wings.
Lori, you served as a consultant on the feature film Contagion and collaborated on the documentary film Unseen Enemy. What do you think those kinds of entertaining genres contribute to shaping knowledge and attitudes around global health emergencies in ways that maybe the news media cannot?
Well, the number one thing I was seeing all over social media about Contagion, the film that was directed by Steven Soderbergh, and I was one of the 3 scientific advisors for, is as we went into lockdowns in the United States, people were watching it. It became the #1 most watched movie on Netflix for a period there. And everybody was saying, wow, this movie predicted all of this. I feel like I'm in the movie Contagion, is what I would hear from people. And I think one of the purposes of doing a film like Contagion is it's very hard for most people to imagine worst case scenarios and to imagine them as more than just sort of, oh, that's the wild stuff over there, but this is how it'll really be. And so whether it's making a movie about the aftermath of thermonuclear war, a movie about rising sea levels and climate change, or a movie about a pandemic, if it's scientifically as accurate as you could possibly be, the intent is to get the collective imagination to go to this very bad place in hopes that out of that will come some social mobilization and some political preparedness.
And perhaps it's also another way to get people out of the echo chambers that you talked about, that you might reach people through a feature film who wouldn't watch your news channel, for example.
I'm sorry, but the big producer of movies for the right is Steve Bannon, who was an advisor to Donald Trump, was in the White House and helped make Donald Trump president of the United States, and runs Breitbart and a whole raft of other right-wing news media. And the other big one, Rupert Murdoch, who owns and operates Fox News and a whole raft of newspapers all over the world. And neither of them would suggest that their followers or they watch that film. And in fact, they've made their own counter movies.
Okay, I'd now like to move to Afghanistan. Schweib, can you share with us what the infodemic looks like in Afghanistan? And what is the media doing to address it? What's working well and what isn't working well?
Thank you very much. I've listed, particularly during the climax, I've listed the sources of information that as an individual and also as a media person, as a journalist, one would face in dealing with, and still a lot of them are in place. So information from media, Afghanistan is heavily, has got radio listeners, but alongside that, we have TV, we have newspapers. So let's call all of that as one source. Then we would have the Afghan government from Ministry of Public Health. Then you have the civil society and community groups. Their information about what really is the information, and here's what reliable information is. What we also have in Afghanistan, we call it news of the roundabout. Somehow rumors and mis and disinformation that this has been going on for more than 100 years, that sometimes that turns out to be true, i.e. whatever you hear from the streets. Chat groups and social media. So you have the social media, the huge amount of information on social media, and then family chat groups. So I am on a chat group of myself, my uncles and my brothers and my wife and hers and her relatives. So there are a lot of times we have conflicting information on two chat groups, but we are in one family. We have to reconcile and say which information of the two chat groups are more reliable. Mosques, very, very loud voice, 5 times a day, people going at least into the mosques. That was another wave of information people are and have been and still are facing. Well, WHO, UNICEF, the UN and others through the PSAs, public service broadcasting on TV and radio. And I would say the neighborhood board announcements. So in each neighborhood or the block of apartments you live, when neighbors gather and say, no, that's not true, this is true. So it's a whole world of multiple channels, all of that sometimes competing against each other. And we've never had such a heavily saturated sort of infodemic, now that we know the word is called infodemic. And as a journalist, if I would just share some of my own experiences, that how we dealt, or we could have dealt, now we have learned, we could have dealt better in the beginning. I would say that as a journalist, sometimes because we learn about one situation and sometimes we forget and we present ourselves as experts and we throw a bit of our judgments in every situation. So we wrap up things and say something. But I think in case of the COVID-19, there were people who analyzed things and the next day he or she himself contradicted himself because the information had changed. So the very first thing that we learned later to avoid saying anything, avoiding any perception of we are the health people with reliable information, if not health workers. So leaving the judgments away, breaking the format. So because of the competition, a lot of media would bring celebrities, would bring top officials on the show to say, oh, you know what the government is not doing, what the government is doing, to draw more audiences. And these people, having been fed with these 8 or 9 channels of information, they would throw whatever information they have, a lot of the time not credible, but then people would really trust them. So I think when I said breaking the format, we should have left the competition aside and brought low-profile people, but really, really the right experts who would really talk to the people and less worried about, oh, the other channel has got so-and-so celebrity, they may have more audience at that peak time. And one thing that really countries like Afghanistan or countries going through conflict, one has to be careful about what we earlier said, where's the state? Because sometimes the state, when it started during last winter, Afghanistan was going through 2 sort of crises, the political crisis out of elections and also the ongoing conflict. So sometimes governments, either intentionally or unintentionally, can benefit from an infodemic situation where it can divert either more fear or less fear, can divert the public attention from the real main other problem, which back then was huge, massive claims of fraud in the elections, and also the conflict. Overall, the most difficult thing for countries like Afghanistan, where 100 die a day of conflict. So the most difficult thing for such an audience is when at least 100 people die a day still. When you go out and you see in one explosion 30, 40 is killed, and you are trying to convince people, hey, do social distancing, be careful, wear masks, because you may or may not die, and people say, for God's sake, look at that, there's a far bigger risk down there. How would you, in terms of really manage to come up with messaging and communication that would really people use that information and change behavior in such a turbulent situation like this is really
I'd like to come back to that point, because this is getting reflected in the public Q&A. Many people are asking questions about how you address this problem. But before we get into that, I'd like to go to Anna for her question. Anna, you've spent your career working on HIV and AIDS communication in Southern Africa. What are the parallels that you're seeing with COVID-19 coverage? And has the media learned the lessons from all of that experience on HIV and AIDS in whether they cover COVID responsibly? And if they haven't, what can they be doing better?
Right, thank you so much for that. Really learning from all the panelists here. So yes, there's been a lot of parallels between HIV and AIDS and COVID-19. We've also, fortunately or unfortunately, here in Zimbabwe, have had experiences with other pandemics as well, including the cholera pandemic in 2008 and in subsequent years. So yes, the parallels are there in that there has been the infodemic. I like this word. It's been there throughout all those things, throughout all those pandemics and the HIV and AIDS epidemic. It's just been there. So we've learned over the years to pick we choose what to really focus on and what not to focus on. And one of the things that have been really difficult and has been common in all those different issues that we've had is the issue of stigma and discrimination. So you find that with HIV, the stigma and discrimination in terms of who gets HIV, what were they doing, how did they get it, is also the same with COVID-19. COVID-19 is associated with risky behavior, like you are not wearing your mask. You're probably not sanitizing as much as you should. Perhaps you went to a party and then when you got there, you were part of a super spreader event, things like that. And so there's been that need to even the language that we use to talk about COVID-19. One of the first lessons that we've had to learn really quickly as a media is to say, to not ask, where is this COVID coming from? Because we've learned from HIV, there's a prominent doctor who likes to talk about how if a snake enters a house, you're not going to ask who brought the snake or why is the snake here. You're going to try and, if it's a poisonous snake, try to get rid of it. So it's the same with COVID-19. All that information that came in to say, it's these people that are coming from outside the country, who are in China or who are elsewhere. These are the ones who are bringing in COVID-19. And we're to say, look, we have something that is here that's going on and we need to do something about it. And that's the first lesson that we've had to learn, the language itself, avoiding stigma and discrimination. And then one of the other ways that we've had to deal with COVID-19 as a media is to say we needed more, in training, more information about it. It's almost, it's scientific. It's not something that's just easy. We know that in journalism school, you learn the basics, the 5 W's and an H, how to write a story, how to produce a program. But with this, it's scientific. You want to now know the difference between a rapid test and a PCR. So what is this azithromycin? What is working and what's not working? How is the vaccine going to work? Are people going to be infected with the virus? How do these things all work? Even including epidemiology, believe it or not, it's part of it. And one of the things that we've seen that works a lot, it's also worked in HIV, because we've had then to tell people how is HIV actually transmitted and why do ARVs work? How does PrEP work? So we've actually to use that kind of experience even for COVID-19 to then say, look, some of these remedies that are being, put forward, how do they work? Do they even work? And it's been super helpful. And another thing that I also need to mention is that the realization that even as health journalists, we know that we have a lot of we have a lot of work in terms of informing and all those things. We are watchdogs and what have you. But at the end of the day, we are also human beings. So we've had journalists who've contracted COVID-19. We've had journalists before. We've spoken about being living positively with HIV. So we've also had journalists coming through talking about their experiences with COVID-19, having also contracted COVID. So it brings that human face to it, and it reminds us as journalists that beyond the story that I'm writing, beyond whoever is the source that I'm going to put the story to, there's a reason why I'm writing the story, and the reason is that we have a pandemic and we need to take care of ourselves.
Thank you, Anna. Those were very concrete suggestions for our colleagues in media in the audience. I want to invite panelists to ask each other questions or to comment on what has been said. But before that, there are a few questions in the chat. I'll try to combine them and also open the floor to see who wants to answer them. Folks are asking questions like, how do you make COVID-19 information interesting, especially in contexts where, as Schweib had mentioned and others, where the numbers are low, where there are competing issues that the public is more interested in, where there is low risk perception. And there are also questions around how to deal with potential vaccine hesitancy. So Anna, given what you've just said, Schweib or others, would you like to come in on how you get more attention to important COVID-19 information in a context where the numbers are low and the risk perception is low?
I actually like the issue, if I could go in first, what's been brought out, the issue of competing news stories. As somebody who's done current affairs before, everybody kind of likes to focus on the current affairs and to look at the politics and all those things. And yes, risk perception may be very low, but I feel like if, what has worked for us is people who have been positive for COVID-19, people who have gone through COVID-19, coming to relay their experiences. Because you find there were some people would say it's just a flu, but if somebody tells you about long COVID, how they suffered, how they couldn't eat anything, how they had to go to all these lengths, how they spent 3 or 4 weeks in hospital, it really brings it closer to home. And even the naysayers, those people who would say, well, COVID-19 is a huge conspiracy. There's actually no such thing. Just recently, we had one of our health correspondents who actually passed on. She had COVID-19, and it sort of sobers everybody up. As long as you have those kind of reports, those kind of stories where somebody can actually see the reality of it. It may be just 10 people have died as opposed to maybe 100,000 in Italy or in New York. But even if you're here in Zimbabwe, one death is just way too many.
Schweib, do you want to come on that one?
I would say one general thing that in Afghanistan, we have been various media platforms, various media outlets tried different things, including there have been artists that they developed songs, very big celebrities, and that the songs became viral, but somehow those messages were not received. People didn't get it that what the song was more. It became more trendy. At least in the context of Afghanistan, I would say I would be careful making the context interesting, like downplaying the impact, the importance of it. Overall, various platforms, I would say, address your audience. You need to have various formats and various platforms, i.e. in radio, for example, in Afghanistan, communities love to hear their own voices or of another person's personal stories to call in and say, hey, so-and-so, I'm so-and-so, I have had this problem, and have a credible expert to give them the response back. So that has been really popular on radio for communities, mostly for adults, I would say. And for TV and social media, digital pieces, so inspirational stories have been really trendy, of something that has worked for somebody, or because in the climax of a lot of despair and disappointment, where there's conflict, there's sort of a failing government, and also we have got now COVID-19, there's a little positive story of somebody has managed to do something, that he or she has managed to run life still being in quarantine. That has been a lot high in demand. And for a younger generation, I'm reflecting from my own kids that it has been so hard to get the messages from the mainstream media, for example, TikTok. So if there has been anything on TikTok, they would believe first TikTok, second anything else. And a lot of us in the media still aren't that much into the world of TikTok, but every audience in terms of age and community, and also cities versus urban, or we have to look at them and serve them to the platform that is appealing to them.
Thank you, Shwaib. I'm going to ask one more question, and then I would like to open it up to the floor for all of the panelists to ask one another questions. This question is for Jamil. You're in Geneva. You cover the WHO, among other things. What do you need from the WHO, UN agencies, civil society organizations as a journalist to help you manage the infodemic?
Yeah, that's an important question for us here, especially covering WHO and all these institutions. If you want to challenge or counter misinformation, you'll need to get to people with, in a way, the technical information, but also in a very practical way. So why is it that I cannot leave my house? Or why is it that I cannot go to another town? Or why is it that I need to wear a mask? Questions that are practical, that yes, invades your privacy in a way, but that actually have scientific explanations. So these scientific explanations need to be relayed to people. We cannot only say you have to do it because you have to do it. It will never work. It's a bit like vaccines, or obligation on vaccines. It won't work. You have to explain why. And for you to explain why, you need access to technical briefings by the experts. Not any experts, but the experts behind those decisions, behind those recommendations. And one thing that we are fighting for here in Geneva is to make sure that the WHO understands that it's not only sound bites that we need. We need technical briefings, information that will generate the explanation to counter what Laurie says. I'm not going to believe this because I'm reading you. I'm going to believe that. Well, we have to go, and I agree with her. I don't have the answer either. But in order for us to go beyond that, you have to count with those taking decisions and making sure that they come and be transparent enough to explain why now the mask is obligatory, or now this city has to be locked down, go on lockdown. So we need from WHO more transparency. You may say, well, but they're giving press conferences every single day. Yes, but it's not press conferences that will kill misinformation. It is not an abundance of press events that will counter the situation. What will counter the situation is the capacity of us journalists to convey the message to the reader, to the listener, to the audience, basically to explain why is it that the vaccine is safe? Why is it that this has to be done in that way? So in a way, we're asking WHO to do what they preach to many countries in the world. Be transparent, but again, transparency is not overflowing us with press events, but with technical briefings that will help us. Now, Yvonne, I have to agree, and I think that this is something we'll all have to agree here. Perhaps not Lori, because she's covering this for many years, but many media outlets and many journalists were not ready for the pandemic. They found out where the WHO was when the pandemic was declared. They found out that the WHO cannot send an army to invade a country and check on the origin of the virus when this happened. So for the next pandemic, as you said, it is going to happen again, yes. So we'll have to get better prepared. We were not prepared neither for the digital world nor for the pandemic, and they happened at the same time. So in a way, and it's a very dramatic situation because obviously the press is not in its full swing in terms of financial, let's say it's not as solid as we could envisage, but it will have to invest in preparing us journalists in order to cover all of this. Otherwise, we'll get stuck in the bogus scientist, in the politician who will claim that he knows. If we don't know, it will be very hard to counter all of that. And for us to know, we'll have to be better prepared for the next one.
Great. So more access to technical experts. Would anyone else in the panel like to come in on what they feel they need to help manage the infodemic from international organizations or civil society organizations or governments? Or comment on anything else?
If I can come in, Yvonne, I would say accessibility, by the experts. We do understand that researchers, we do understand that, there's even WHO and people in Geneva, they're very, very busy. But sometimes that's the only way we can, get to counter some of these issues, because at the end of the day, you as a journalist, you're forced to reach out for the low-hanging fruit. It's the very famous celebrity who's looking like, somebody said here, they love the sound of their own voice. Somebody wants their 2 minutes of fame, and then they'll tell you something, there may be a quirky scientist who comes and tells you that, no, actually, this COVID-19 is a hoax. So what you need is, our researchers to be very, very available. I know that sometimes as media, and this is, I have to, to say it.
It looks like we may have lost Anna. In the meantime, Liz or Lori, would you like to come in?
Yeah, so I'm coming from a really different perspective. I mean, we have a massive catastrophic epidemic in this country. I don't find the WHO press conferences at all helpful. And I can't afford in my working day to take 2 hours, get up at crack of dawn in order to watch Geneva for 2 hours, listening to, can you hear me? Can you hear me? Oh, you're cutting out for 2 hours. And not one person, I don't get any questions in through the deluge, and not one person asks a question that's relevant to my situation and to what's going on in America. And so it's just a total waste of my time. It would be very helpful if WHO immediately published transcripts so that we could read through them. Instead, you make us so we have to go back and watch the darn thing later for 2 hours, which I don't have time to do. So I actually haven't attended a WHO press conference now. I've pretty much been boycotting them for several months. And I would say, we just yesterday, for example, simultaneously, our new President Biden held his health and vaccine and COVID summit. Our President of the United States held a COVID summit in the White House. Our Congress was debating whether or not they're going to do anything to bail out the millions of Americans that are facing starvation because of lockdowns and shutdowns of businesses, with the two parties at war with each other. We had a woman who claims to be a health department official who's been stifled by her governor, arrested at gunpoint with guns pointed at her children by local authorities claiming she's spreading lies. And we had to figure out, is she for real or not? We had new announcements about the vaccines coming from, again, press releases from the companies, which I just generally discard as untrue because they're written as press releases. And then we had the first real analysis from our Food and Drug Administration of the Pfizer vaccine with real data. And we had the first real rollout in the UK. And that rollout now turns out to have resulted in allergic responses in some of the recipients, none of which had been in the alleged press release good data from the company. And I could go on. I mean, that doesn't even hit the tip of the iceberg of one day's worth of news. How in the world am I going to fit a 2-hour darn press conference in a day like that? So I think WHO has completely missed the boat. I wrote back in March or April a long piece for Lancet analyzing why communications was so poor in this epidemic. And that was way back when it was, a relatively small epidemic, pandemic. And I specifically said the WHO never put communications front and center of its funding requests, of its personnel response to a crisis. And that, at that time, I believe you had 5 full-time personnel total for communications response at WHO, 1 for social media. That was insane. And I went through all the data and analyzed what other countries were doing for communications. And generally, I think it's very poor that the interface between the official government or official multilateral or official United Nations response and the media is woefully insufficient, woefully underfunded. And personally, I've not been granted an interview with anybody at WHO in so many months that I've stopped even bothering asking.
Melinda, I see you've appeared on screen again. Would you like to comment on anything you've heard?
Well, yeah, thank you everybody for sharing your time with us. And I think for me, leading in the sort of more risk comms area of our response, it's been nice to kind of hear a lot of messages echoed that we've been, trying to say all along and really trying to prepare countries for, previous to COVID-19 around how to communicate uncertainty, how to share decision-making processes, in particular, the last 2 comments from Jamil and Lori. We'll definitely take this to heart, that the WHO could improve upon our sharing of our decision-making processes. And then I think it seems to me there's more need to be a little bit more relevant in particular countries' situations. I think the things that you're facing, Lori, right now with the amount of information, and then at least from this level, that it's not as relevant for your.
Can I just ask you one thing?
Sure.
I'm sitting here in the allegedly richest, allegedly most powerful nation in the world with the definitely largest epidemic and a president who said, we're pulling out of WHO. How could we be this far down the road since my president started the process of withdrawing the United States from the World Health Organization, and you've not once held an America-specific press conference? You've not once had a WHO official hold a press conference here at UN headquarters in New York. You've not once sought to actively engage the media in the United States specifically when it's the US that's going to withdraw half of your funding and do everything it can to denounce and destroy your organization. It makes no sense to me. I don't understand what the hell is going on in Geneva. And why do you assume that everybody in America in the media will go on Geneva time zone and kowtow to you to get information and response? It's crazy. Don't you want to protect your organization? I don't get it.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, I actually don't work in the media area. I work more in the translation of science, but I will carry those messages actually, and a lot of my colleagues are online right now listening to your comments, and we'll take them to heart. Just a couple things. I know that we have altered our press conference times. We do have separate press conferences in the region, in the PAHO region, Americas, that probably are more addressing the needs of the US for sure. Well, anyway, listen, thank you for your comments. Thank you for sharing your time today. and your ideas, the challenges you faced during the infodemic, and also the solutions moving forward. It's our hope after this session, after the breakout sessions, cafes afterwards, with more members of the media industry and journalists, that will spend some more time coming up with some really concrete solutions for the next infodemic. We'll take the challenges that we discussed last week, add them to the solutions that we'll discuss today, and be able to move forward, because hearing from everybody's vast amount of experience in this area, this is not the last time we're going to be faced with this. I think for certain when it comes to the infodemic, this is by far the most challenging with I mean, you just heard about Lori's yesterday, right? the amount of information flowing into your laptops and what you need to report on, it's just sounds overwhelming as journalists, and we rely on you as one of the primary conduits to the population being affected by this. So we thank you for your service. Thank you for your time today. As mentioned, there will be concrete outcomes from these two sessions, and moving forward, WHO will partner with BBC Media Action and Internews to work on some tangible areas of work for journalists and the media moving forward. So with that, I'd like to thank you for your time. For those participants online, many of you have been invited to these separate breakout sessions. You would have received an invitation from a WHO email address yesterday. So please join those sessions if you can. Your opinion and your perspective is very much valued, and we need to learn more to improve next time. So thanks again, everybody, for your time and sharing. And thank you, Yvonne, for moderating.